We're going to bring in Yasmine Sherif. She's the Executive Director of the UN's Global Fund. Education cannot wait, and she's joining us now from New York. Good to have you with us. Just going through that list of numbers alone, to a certain extent, doesn't even give an indication of the impact this must be having on the education of all these children.
Absolutely. I think we tend to focus on climate change as a phenomenon in itself, but the consequences and the human suffering, and here we speak particularly for young school-aged children. An estimated, according to their World Organization, 40 million children around the globe have their education disrupted every year as a result of climate-induced disasters.
How is it possible to build climate-resistant schools, climate-resistant systems of education, but to do it in time? Because the impression I'm getting from the reports that we've just had from our correspondents is that time is of the essence here, and that seems to be a factor that seems to be eluding a lot of the people that will be funding any sort of improvements to the school system and the education system.
Well, at Education Cannot Wait, the United Nations Global Fund for Education in Emergency and Protracted Crisis, we ensure that the education curriculum, number one, entails the knowledge for the future generation to manage climate change. But we also have examples of how we address it. Take the cyclone Ida in Mozambique a few years ago in 2019, where we came in and supported education for those who have lost it and were displaced. And now they have rebuilt those schools and made them climate resilient. So there's always a chance to build back better, while you're also educating the new generation. And that's the very clear link between climate change and education. It is the channel to make sure it doesn't happen again and to rebuild back better.
Obviously, you're only able to cope, well, agencies like yours as well are only able to deal with a specific number of children. These numbers are very, very large. What happens to the kids who fall through the cracks, as it were? We are talking about thousands of children who are being affected by this.
Yes, of course. It all depends how much we are able as an international community to provide in funding. There are 222 million children and adolescents today that live in crisis-affected countries. Most of them are on the extreme high risk. And we have estimated that we can support 20 million of them if we had $1.5 billion in funding in the coming 4 years. But of course, if we were more generous, we could reach all 222 million and their schools and their education and rebuild and ensure that they're resilient to future shocks of climate change, while also preparing them to govern their countries and populations one day with a climate-sensitive approach. So there's much that needs to be done when we invest in climate change.
The children that we're talking about are obviously the future for all the countries that they represent. What kind of response do you get from governments when you talk to them about trying to change their funding policies to try to make their education systems more climate resilient?
Well, let me say this. We just had the finance conference in Geneva, Switzerland in February, where governments generously contributed $826 million towards education. But there's a whole climate change community out there where billions of dollars are put into climate change. However, you have to connect the dots. You have to connect the dots between climate change-induced disasters, as earthquake, as we saw in Turkey and Syria, the floods in Pakistan, what's happening in Philippines, and so forth, to the consequences on the human population. And education is one of the most disruptive consequences, because it means that children are not going to school, and they are going to go into early child marriages, unwanted pregnancies, be sexual abuse, and certainly never learn about climate change to prevent it in the future. If we can connect the dots, like we do between armed conflict and the consequences on the human population and displacement, that we do the same in the climate change community to the consequences of children and their education, then far more funding would flow in towards education and rebuilding more resilient systems and teaching the future generation to prevent this from happening. So it's about connecting the dots.
Yasmine Sherif is Executive Director of the UN's Global Fund. Education cannot wait. Ma'am, thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Rob.